a huge thank you, first of all, again, to Mara and to My Jewish Learning for inviting me to come and teach the Parashat class this week. This is not my first time doing something with My Jewish Learning, and I appreciate the invitation the first time, and in some ways I even more deeply appreciate a repeat invite. So thank you again for having me this time and every time so far. A huge thank you to all of you who are joining as well. Just by coincidence, the very first person who happened to join is someone who was at the first Parashat class I taught at My Jewish Learning. I know we've connected a couple of times offline as well, and we've Zoomed a couple of times together. So it was wonderful seeing the very, very first name and face being a familiar one. So to those of you with whom I've connected before on My Jewish Learning or on other spaces, wonderful to see you. And to those of you with whom I'm connecting the first time, as Mara said, please don't be shy. Please, if you have questions, pop them in the chat. If you have comments, reflections, please let me know. I certainly cannot and will not promise that I'm going to be able to get to every single question and comment. I will do my best to engage with them. And a couple of times throughout the morning, Mara is going to, as she said, present the source sheet, and I will also put my email in the chat box. Please feel free to reach out. Please feel free to follow up. Rabbi, there's something you said, I wanted to follow up on it. Or Rabbi, there's something you said, I'm confused. Or Rabbi, I have a question that has nothing to do with anything we were talking about, and I've just been looking for someone to ask a question. Please feel free to reach out. I'm not always 100% the best at responding to 100% of the people by email 100% quickly, but I will get back to everyone at some point. So, but please do feel free to reach out. I would love to hear from you. I see that some of you have posted in the chat where you are from. I'm in Milwaukee. I see some people are saying hello again. It is wonderful to see you. And I love that I'm starting to recognize some names and, more importantly, some faces. So thank you all again for joining. Thank you again to My Jewish Learning for hosting me. Our Parasha, our Torah portion this week is Vaetchanan. It is the second in the book of Devarim. Devarim is the fifth of the 5 books of the Torah. In English, Devarim gets translated as Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy, of course, is not an English word. It is actually a compound Greek word. It is a Greek word composed of deutero, which means second, and nomos, which means telling. So Deuteronomy is really the second telling. Deuteronomy has really 3 primary features throughout the book, one of which is Moses really reminds the Israelite people of everything that has happened to them up until they got to this point. Because right now they are at the foot of the land of Israel. They are getting ready to enter the land of Israel. They've been slaves. They've been wandering for 40 years. Lots of good things, lots of lows in these 40 years. They're at the land of Israel, ready to go in. Moses is giving his final speech. It's more his final series of speeches, which is incredibly ironic because Moses' first self-reflective comment in the book of Exodus is that he's kind of slow of tongue. And yet he spends all of Deuteronomy speaking, right? And a huge part of what he's doing is reminding the Israelites of everywhere they have come from. Right? In Judaism, we often ask, this is the question that the angel first asked to Hagar in the book of Genesis, where are you coming from and where are you going? And that's central not just to us as Jews, but to us as people. Where are you coming from and where are you going? A huge part of the book of Deuteronomy is going to be focused on where you're going, into the land of Israel. What do you need to do? Excerpts of Vaetchanan are that way too. And a huge part of the book of Deuteronomy is Moses reminding everyone where they came from. So what I'd like to do is, I have no concrete set of time. I know we have a hard stop in 40 minutes. So I want to bring up a couple of texts. And if we spend all of our time discussing and reflecting on 2 texts, great. If we have more time and learn a little bit more from the book or from the Parsha of the Vaetchanan, fine. I have no particular agenda that we have to spend X number of time on a particular source. But the first that I want to talk about is really the opening verses of the Vaetchanan. And I want us to focus on that because we see a very different side of Moses from what we've seen up in the Torah up until now. And just a little bit of context, Moses is often considered the most humble of leaders, right? Just so humble, so self-effacing, so concerned with the well-being of the Israelites, with the well-being of the people whom he is leading. And I think these are genuine attributes that we see in Moses, right? I don't think he's putting on a show. And we are about to see a very, very different side of Moses, because as you might recall, toward the end of the book of Numbers, God tells Moses he's not going to be leading the Israelites into the land of Egypt. Into the land of Israel. God tells Moses, you're not going to lead them into the land of Israel. Not only that, God says to Moses, you are going to die on a hilltop overlooking the land of Israel. You won't even be allowed to step foot in the land of Israel. Right? This is the Moses who, despite his slow of tongue nature, spoke to Pharaoh. This is the Moses who recognized the plight of the Israelites in Egypt. This is the Moses who led the Israelites through thick and thin, through tsuris, through wonderful times, through the land of, through the desert for 40 years. This is the Moses who time and time again interceded with God on the Israelites' behalf, interceded with the Israelites on God's behalf. Intercessor is probably a better word than prophet for what the role of the prophet is, right? Moses has been doing this for 40 years. And now he can't lead the people into the land of Israel. And not only that, he can't even step foot, right? God isn't saying, you know what, you're not leading the people in. They're all going to go in, hang back for 10 days. Then you can go step foot in the land of Israel. No, punishment doesn't fit the crime. Ginger is posting in the chat, right? And Ginger, this is one of those things I will offer we can follow up with either another time. You feel free to email me. I'll put my email again because I don't want to get too derailed with why this is Moses' punishment, right? But here we're going to see a slightly different side to Moses. Scott, I'm so grateful that you posted what you just posted, because this is also something I wanted to make sure to emphasize, that despite the side of Moses we're about to see here, his focus and priority has always been who's taking over. That's always his first, second, third, and fourth question. What we are about to see at the beginning of this parsha is a very different side of Moses. And this also speaks, in my eyes, so highly of Moses. God says, Moses, you're not going to let the people in. Moses' first response is not to cross his arms, stomp his feet, and scream, why? His response is, who's going to lead the people? And time again, publicly, Moses has done everything he could do to affirm Joshua as the leader, right? He has publicly anointed Joshua. So he has really done a remarkable job ensuring the healthy succession and transition. And it's only now in private in our parsha this week that we're going to see a very plaintive side of Moses. I am going to share my screen. Mara, would you do me a favor and just pop once more the link to the text? We're going to use the text from Sefaria, which I personally love as a resource. So we're going to use the text. I'll have it up in Hebrew and in English. Feel free to use the text from your own computer if you want to follow the link, or feel free to scroll with me. Just really quickly, Jen, you asked about Moses' grave. According to our tradition, we don't know where he's buried, right? He goes up to a mountain, dies on a hilltop somewhere overlooking the land of Israel, and we don't know where that grave is. Marty, that other half of Reuben, half of Manasseh, Reuben, and Gad, which are on the other side of the Jordan, eventually that becomes part of the Israelite territory under the reign of King David when he expands. But when they got to the land of Israel, across the Jordan is when God says, this is going to be the land that I assign to you. So that where Moses is right now isn't really the land of Israel, at least at that point. Vaetchanan. Oops, let me pop the chat box up here too so I can see the chat as it comes up. All right. So Vaetchanan. I pleaded with Adonai at that time, saying, and the Hebrew Vaetchanan, in Judaism, we have a prayer service called Tachanun, which is not the most common prayer service that we tend to recite. We have a prayer service called Tachanun, which traditionally is recited after the weekday morning prayers and the weekday afternoon prayers. And we typically recite it after we recite the Amidah. The Amidah traditionally is a prayer of personal supplication. It has become standardized. The text has become standardized. So traditionally, after we recite the Amidah, we recite Tachanun, where we put our hand on our forearm, and we often recite personal plaintive entreaties to God. And that's okay. We're allowed to ask God to help us personally meet our wants and needs. We're allowed to do that. But as we learned from Moses, there's something about making sure the needs of the people are met first and then entreating for yourself. But here Moses pleads with God in verse 24, "O Lord Adonai, you who let your servant see the first works of your greatness and your mighty hand," right? The splitting of the sea, the plagues, right? The saving the Israelites. These are the first works of God's greatness that God did publicly, these first marvels and wonders. God, you who let your servant, who let me see these, you whose powerful deeds no God in heaven or on earth can equal. And this is a fascinating phraseology that can beg a multiple series conversation and course, because this does not seem to imply monotheism as we typically understand it. And we're going to come back to this a little bit later, presuming we have time, right? Moses is saying, you, the one and only God that has ever existed in the history of the universe, no, you whose powerful deed no God in heaven or on earth can equal. There's almost an implication that there are other gods, but we will get back to that, right? So you, God, the mighty, the powerful, let me, I pray, cross over and see the good land on the other side of the Jordan, that good hill country and the Lebanon. Right? Moses' plea is not, God, please restore me to be the leader of the Israelite people. Moses' plea is not anything else but just let me go in the land. Parenthetically, I don't care if I go in separately. I don't care if you tell everyone that I'm not going in the land. I just want to be able to set foot in the land. I cannot imagine Moses' pain and passion here. Having led the people for 40 years in the desert, not even literally to be able to step foot in the land. This is Moses' passionate plea. Then we see Moses turn the table a little bit, right? Adonai was wrathful with me on your account, right? This is all, this is a Moses putting the blame somewhere else, right? Moses saying, the reason I'm not being let into the land of Israel is because of you, Israelites, right? And again, this is not typical Moses, right? So I can't overstate enough. This is not typical Moses, right? But this is what happens in our Parsha, right? Where Moses is essentially saying, it's your fault that I'm not being let into the land of Israel. On the one hand, he's not entirely wrong. The people complained, they transgressed, blank, 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 and eventually, the people's constant transgression and whining set into set into a series of events that culminated in Moses not being let into the land. And Moses still needs to be accountable for his actions, right? Because the final straw, as it were, back in Numbers, is God telling Moses to tap the rock, to speak to the rock and tap it once. Moses instead hits the rock twice, and that is when God makes the determination that Moses is not going into the land of Israel, right? So this is Moses. You can hear almost some of the bitterness coming out, right? If you hadn't done all these terrible things, I wouldn't be in a position where I am barred from the land. Right? So Moses is almost turning a little bit on the people he led so passionately and so ably. And then in verse 27, God continues to speak to Moses and really redirects Moses. Go up to the summit of Pisgah and gaze about to the west, to the north, the east, the south, and the east. Look at it well, for you shall not go across yonder to the Jordan. Right? Sometimes as a parent, we need to use a calm voice, repeat something to our kids, right? No, I need you to go to your room, put your toys away like you said you were going to do. When you're done, come back out, and then we're going to have our evening snack, right? Sometimes we need to use that calm and clear voice. So I can hear God kind of redirecting Moses. And then I forget who it was. It might have been Scott. Sorry if I'm misremembering, who in the comments noted how Moses very consistently made sure that his succession plan was in place. This is also God redirecting Moses again in verse 28. Give Joshua his instructions. Imbue him with strength and courage, for he shall go across at the head of this people, and he shall allot to them the land that you may only see. Right? This is God redirecting Moses. Remember what your primary role is here, what we really need out of you, right? You need to help this succession plan. I'm going to take a couple of moments and scroll through some of the more recent comments. If people have more questions or comments, please feel free to put them in the chat. Yes, Moses, I forget if it's Aljeya. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. I know good to see you again. Thank you for joining. And I apologize if I got your name pronunciation incorrect. But Aljeya noted that Moses' time as a leader was over. I think that's kind of the clear message from why God actually didn't let Moses continue. I don't think it was a quote unquote punishment for Moses hitting the rock. I think it's a recognition that Moses' time was kind of over. Sheridan succinctly adds, Moses was tired. I don't think you are wrong. And then someone from iPad, Moses so badly wanted to enter the land, he seemed to undervalue just for a moment the most amazing relationship. Right, yeah, right. So he really seemed to become, his focus really seemed to be on entering the land. Right, and by the way, that's okay. We are allowed to focus on our personal wants and needs, right? We need to do that in balance, right? We cannot only focus on other people's wants and needs. There are times where we need to say, look, I'm at a place where I need to name my wants and needs right now. And I'm actually grateful that Moses does. And I think God does a wonderful job of redirecting Moses here, because there's certainly times when God can get hot-headed, if you'll forgive the anthropomorphism there. And I see there are lots and lots and lots of comments in the chat. No, God never promised Moses that his reward would be to live in the land of Israel. God always tells Moses his job is to lead the people to the land in Israel, though I certainly think it's fair that Moses expected that he would, if nothing else, at least be able to set foot into the land. Yeah, this certainly could be Babaji. Oh, wonderful. Hello, how are you? Right? So Babaji, this certainly could be an expression of bitterness too. And once that bitterness sinks in, this could be a sort of, yeah, once that bitterness has seeped in, you're no longer the right person to lead the people and to continue on with your role. Yeah, so thank you for all of these wonderful additional comments. Any other comments or reflections that people want to put in? Right, Moses was burnt out. That's a very common thread. Thank you, Jay, for adding that as well. All right, so this was the first text I wanted to share, in large part because it really is just a very, very different side of Moses. And I know we've said it a couple times at the beginning, but just for anyone who joined a little bit late, I don't want us to use this text for us to define Moses. This really is out of character, which in the larger context, to me, actually speaks incredibly, incredibly highly of Moses. If we were to spend all of our time reading through the entire Parsha, we would eventually get to chapter 5, which is the Decalogue. Once again, a repeat of the 10 Commandments. I think that Decalogue is a better word than 10 Commandments. If we have time, we'll come back and spend a little bit of the time at the Decalogue. But I want us to jump ahead to chapter 6. The first 3 verses of chapter 6 are probably not familiar to most of us, in the sense that we probably don't study it time and time and time again. But once we get to verse 4, we start to have some very, very, very familiar language to us. So One of the worst things you can do as a teacher is say, hey, here is a source sheet. Don't look at it until we get there. You all have the link to the source sheet. So if your patience is itching at you, go ahead and scroll down a little bit. But we're going to start with the intro couple of verses. Here we are, chapter 6, and this is the instruction, Zot HaMitzvah. This is the instruction, the laws and the rules that your God Adonai has commanded me to impart to you, to be observed in the land that you are about to cross into and occupy. One quick note about that. There are some laws that we can only follow in the land of Israel. Right? There are also some laws that are going to be new when the Israelites get to the land of Israel, right? Once you are no longer an enslaved people, once you are no longer a nomadic people wandering in the desert, once you are a people who is in a land and who has responsibility to care for that land, you have additional obligations as well, right? So there are going to be some new responsibilities that come to you once you are in the land of Israel. So this is the instruction that you're going to have when you get into the land of Israel. Verse 2, so that you, your children, and your children's children may revere your God Adonai and follow as long as you live all the divine laws and commandments that I enjoin upon you, to the end that you may long endure. Right? We talked at the very beginning, where are you coming from and where are you going? Right? Here's where the Israelites came from. They came from enslavement. They came from wandering the desert. Tanya, yes, it very, very much is. It's a series of speeches. And I think we talked about that a little bit at the intro, and sorry if I mentioned it before you were able to join. So yes, that's a great observation, Tanya. Right? So we've talked a lot about where you're coming from, but a reminder where you're going, not just physically into a new land, but you need to go to a spiritual place, to an emotional place where you are doing this to impart it to your children, right? Rich observes also, once again, the emphasis on the children, that recurs in this parsha. If you go back a little bit later, just read, take 5 minutes and just scan through Vaetchanan as a parsha, you're going to see kids come up time and time again. The whole premise of the Seder is about teaching it to your kids. Right, and we have excerpts and hints of Seder teaching that come from this parsha as well, right? So yes, once again, you have not been redeemed, Israelite people, for your sake alone. You have been redeemed for your sake and for the sake of future generations. Remember, this is the initial promise God made to Abraham way back in the book of Genesis. God didn't say, I am going to make a great generation out of you, Abraham. I am going to make a great people out of you. Your children and your descendants will be as numerous as the stars in the sky, as the sand on the shore of the beach. So the fulfillment of the promise has to be that you are now accountable for imparting this to your children. Right? It's not God's job in every generation to teach this anew to the children. Once you have learned something, it's your job to continue to pass it on, right? And you know, Scott just posted a note here. One of the things that I've learned in nonprofit leadership, I'm not going to say anything novel. Anyone who's worked in nonprofit knows this. This is the first truism that you hear, is that if a nonprofit is truly set up with strong infrastructure, then any single person can leave and the nonprofit is still going to be able to continue. Right? If too much quote unquote power is in one person's hand in a nonprofit, you're not set up for the long term. And this is what Moses is doing as well, is really setting up the people for long-term sustained success, that they can be fine without him. And that's not self-effacing. That's not, oh, what do I matter? But if he's doing his job well, the people are going to be fine without him. Verse 3, obey, O Israel, willingly and faithfully. Right? Don't follow God's laws grudgingly. Do it with an open heart, with a full heart. Obey, O Israel, willingly and faithfully, that it may go well with you, that you may increase greatly in a land flowing with milk and honey, as Adonai, the God of your ancestors, spoke to you. Right? Deuteronomy is not shy about a theology where if you follow God's laws, you'll be rewarded, and if you disobey, you'll be punished. Right? That'll also be need to be a conversation for another time. But that is central to Deuteronomic theology and ideology. Reward and punishment is immediate for the actions of the people, right? So not only are you doing this for the sake of future generations, right? You do this for your own sake. Follow God's laws willingly, faithfully, so that it may go well with you, right? Gail, exactly. This is God reminding Moses, who is now reminding the Israelite people of the transition plan. It might be hard emotionally. And truthfully, some of the people might look around in their private tents and whisper in the private tents, look, I'm all about Moses, don't get me wrong, but I'm kind of ready for new leadership, right? As a Packers fan, this is what I'm saying about Aaron Rodgers now being in New York and Jordan Love taking over. I'm actually ready for new leadership for the Green Bay Packers. That is definitely a topic for another time, right? But certainly, like sometimes there are people who are going to say, look, I'm ready for new leadership, and that can be okay. There might be a lot of people who are heartbroken and devastated, insecure what's going to happen next, but we have to have the transition plan. All right, all of this preamble is now getting us to verse 4 in chapter 6 here in Vaetchanan. This is going to be familiar, verses 4 through 7. Verse 4 in Hebrew, Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. And the verses afterwards are the Ve'ahavta paragraph. Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha. We certainly will not have time in our remaining time together to fully unpack the Shema, the Ve'ahavta, everything it means. I just want to highlight for a moment briefly initially, look back to verse 7, right? Impress them upon your children, right? Here are the children again, right? Impress them upon your children. But I want to take a moment to reflect on Shema, and this is a bit of a callback to something that I referenced earlier. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Anyone who speaks Hebrew in full, anyone who knows even just a little bit of Hebrew might be familiar with the word Echad, right? Because Echad means one. Echad, Shayim, Shalosh, Shabbat, Chamesh, Shesh, Echad means one, right? Go back to the Seder. Echad mi yodeya, Echad ani yodeya. Who knows one? Echad means one. One of my professors at JTS, I went to rabbinical school at Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. One of my professors, Dr. Geller, brilliant textual analytic mind, wrote a paper suggesting that the way that we use echad now as one is not how the word echad is being used in this context. And one of the things he falls back on is that all languages have evolved over time, that if you learn about 500 words, you'll be able to read and understand about 90% of the Torah, of the 5 books of Moses, because the language, the lexicon was much smaller back then. There was just many fewer words, which means many words had to have multiple meanings and interpretations, right? So now we might have multiple words for joy, happiness, enthusiasm, vigor, exuberance, right? We have many words for joys, but when English was first forming as a language, we probably had fewer words, and it had many more subtleties imbued within that word. And Dr. Geller is suggesting that echad is, like many of those words, had multiple meanings, and that his belief is that in the context of the Torah, echad does not mean one, but rather means alone. And you'll see that is the translation that Sefaria also embraces. And there is a very deep theological insight here, which goes back to something that I mentioned briefly earlier and said I would come back to. Imagine this. Hear, O Israel, Adonai, our God, Adonai is one. Now imagine that same sentence. Hear, O Israel, Adonai is our God, Adonai alone. Remember earlier where we showed the verse where it seems to say that Moses recognized that there's no other God like God, right? Think about Mi Chamocha, which the Israelites sang after the sea was split and they crossed the sea, which we sing every day as part of our liturgy. Mi Chamocha ba'elim Adonai. Literally, who is like you, Adonai, among the gods? Imagine we knew nothing about Judaism, about theology, about what we believe, and we were reading the text of the Bible for the first time. It would seem to suggest that God is alone among the gods. There is no other God like God. Right? We tend to think about Judaism as a monotheistic religion where there is one and only one God and all other gods are false gods. Right? And I'm not suggesting that theology is wrong. Don't get me, please don't misunderstand me. I just want to say in the myopic context of the Torah, there seems to be a thread that God is the goddess of the gods, right? That Adonai is our God, Adonai alone, and that we are to have a one-to-one relationship with Adonai, right? We are not a people who worship other gods, and this is the story of the story of Abraham. According to the Midrash, one of the reasons that God picked Abraham to lead the people is because Abraham on his own came to recognize the singularity of God. That Abraham, according to one of the Midrash, recognized that there must be some kind of God that controls all the forces of the universe beyond the ones that are easily observed, right? So this is one of those threads which in some ways might be very problematic theologically because we're not used to hearing it. And on the other hand, I think it's important to note that this does seem to be a thread within the Torah. So when we go back earlier in Vaetchanan, and we see that Moses said that you, God, are unique, that is not necessarily so out of character for the theology of the Torah. Certainly as Jews, we have come to teach that there is one and only one God. And I'm seeing some comments here in the chat along that if people have questions about that as well. And certainly, Jen, as you're noting, this also gives us as anyone who has a monotheistic approach, this idea also does give us space to acknowledge that there might be people with other theologies, and giving us space to do it less in a you are wrong way, versus this is not how I believe or what I believe in God. This is not what we as Jews traditionally believe in is God. And I understand you might have a different theology, and hopefully that gives us space to embrace other theologies, even if that's not necessarily ours. Mono-idolatry. Oh, I had not heard that term before, Cindy. Mono-idolatry. Thank you very much for putting that in the chat. I'm going to need to follow up with that. Mono-idolatry versus monotheism. That's a new term for me, right? Right. And then Jeanette, right? In some ways, there's a theology that God, whether you can call it a theology or not, there's certainly an approach that God is really a human construct, right? Or that a lot of times we turn things into gods, but really there is one God that is unique and beyond all of that, and that really is God. And then rhymes with papaya. Bamaya offers right that there might be a theological sensibility to this in the context of Canaan, in the context of Egypt, and that there's a singularity, an aloneness to this God. So, oh, great, Noreen, thank you for adding the Zoroastrian teaching there too. I always appreciate when we hear commonalities and also contrast with other faith practices. Thank you very much. Other questions, comments, reflections about any of this? All right, we've got about 8.5 minutes left, and I want to honor my Jewish Learning's time. I know that there's going to be a bit of a hard stop at 11:15 Eastern. I'm going to try to quickly highlight two more things in our Parsha. Just putting them out there. Once again, I'm going to put my email here in the chat. Please feel free to follow up, connect with me by email. I love hearing from people. I will do my best to get back to people as quickly as possible. One thing I want to jump back, I mentioned before that the Decalogue is repeated here in this Parsha. We often call it the 10 Commandments. One of the other things that we see in the book of Deuteronomy is sometimes the retelling of the stories the retelling is a little bit off. If you've told the same story 100 times, unless you are a rehearsed thespian who's reading from a script, you're going to tell a story a little bit differently every time. That's also the case with some of the stories that are being retold. Even the Decalogue themselves, the 10 Commandments, have a couple of shifts. And if you look here in verse 12 says, observe the Shabbat, observe the Sabbath day, and keep it holy as your God Adonai has commanded you. In Exodus, the first word is not observe, right? Anyone want to put in the chat what the first word is? Or you can take yourself off Zoom and put the first word is. Going once, going twice. It's not observe the Shabbat, it is remember, right? So Zachor, thank you. Yes, now we have them. Jade popping it up into Zachor, right? So in Exodus, we're taught Zachor et Yom Shabbat lekadesho. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy, and now observe. On the one hand, that might make some sense, right? Because when you are newly freed people, first, let's start remembering the sanctity of Shabbat. Now that you are going to be really in possession of a land, we can talk about what it means to possess a land another time. Now that you're going to be in a possession of land, now you need to observe it. Your relationship with Shabbat is going to evolve. According to the Kabbalists, the reason that this is different is something that we're taught in Lecha Dodi. So tonight begins Shabbat, and the Shabbat is welcomed with the Kabbalat Shabbat service. The highlight of that service is Kabbalat Shabbat, is Lecha Dodi, and Lecha Dodi Likrat Kala. One of the 9 verses of Lecha Dodi, and again, it's ascribed to the Kabbalists, is Shamor v'zachor b'dibur echad. Shamor v'zachor. Observe and remember in one utterance. According to the Kabbalists, God said, remember and observe simultaneously in one utterance. We, in our limited human capacity, are unable to hear both at the same time or write both at the same time. So we wrote Zachor, remember, one time, Shamor, observe the other time. God spoke both simultaneously. We comprehended both simultaneously, but we, in our limited humanness, can only write or say one at a time, and that's why they're written differently in the Decalogue. Rich, the short answer is no. Shabbat is sacred time, and that is a time that is imbued upon us. And I know that there are people who have to work on Shabbat. And we please, again, send me an email. I'd be happy to follow up with you on that, because that's a very powerful question. So I'd be happy to follow up with you on that. I do want to point out one more thing in our Parsha, and then I will leave a couple moments for gratitude, and then to wish all of you a Shabbat Shalom. Chapter 6, verse 18. Right, Jay, thank you for noting which verse it is in the Chadodi. Chapter 6, verse 18. You know, sometimes we want to say, all right, this is all overwhelming. Or sometimes we're going to say, I love diving into things deeply. What's the summary? What's the cliff notes? What's the Torah for Dummies manual? This, I think, is a pretty darn good verse, or a couple of verses, right? If you want to focus on what does this all really mean? Ve'asita hayashar ve'hatov be'enei Adonai. Do what is right and good in the sight of Adonai. That's kind of it. Really, that's what it means to be a Jew. I don't want to be so bold as to say that's what it means to be a human being, because other faith practices might teach something differently. But I have to imagine that if all people on this world essentially were to do what is right and good in the sight of their God, I think we'd be doing pretty darn well in this world. Right? I really think we would be. Scott, that I think is the other central verse. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Right? Do what is right and good in the sight of Adonai. And part of the reason I love it is because it's so simple. Right? Don't overthink this. KISS as an acronym. Keep it simple, stupid. Right? Don't overthink it. Do what is right and good. You know what is right. You know what is good. You know what is pushing boundaries a little bit, and you know what is way over the edge. And in case you don't, we have the powerful complexity of what is right in the sight of Adonai. That's why we have this Torah. That's why we have this in teaching, because this whole Torah helps expound to the best of our understanding what God asks of us. And if we can study the Torah, if we can learn the Torah, if we can apply the Torah's teachings to this world, we might mess it up. In fact, I guarantee we're going to mess it up more than once. But if we're really focused in on the instruction of the Torah, and we do our best to live that out as what is right and good in the sight of Adonai, I'm pretty darn confident that we're going to be doing a really good job leading healthy, meaningful lives and making the world a little bit healthier, and hopefully creating more health and meaning for the lives of those around us. So I know that often sounds simple, and I often end so many of my teachings say, and hopefully this inspires you to do a little bit better in your life, and in turn make the world a little bit of a better place. I end most of my teachings that way, and I don't say that as a tritism, but I say that a bit as a truism, which I really get from here, right? Try to do a little bit better for yourself. Try to make the world a little bit better. And I think if we all do that, then we're going to have a profound impact on the world. Before I say goodbye, I see that I see that Barry and that Sheridan ask a couple of powerful questions as well. Please don't think of me as dismissing or diminishing this. We have about a minute and a half. So again, I'm putting my email address in. Please, please, please feel free to email me. I don't always get back within 24 hours. I know the business world teaches you to get back to everyone within one business day. I don't always do that, depending on what's on my schedule, but I will get back to you. Thank you for the kind words in the chat as well. Thank you also very, very much for coming, for your questions, for your comments, for your engagement, for your reflections. Once again, my name is Moishe Steigmann, and I'm the founder and director of Own Your Judaism. If you'd like to go to my website or send me an email, I'm happy to put you on my email list. I can keep you up to date of other teachings and programming that we do. A lot of it is virtual as well. You can go to my website and sign up, or just send me an email. And again, a very, very deep thanks to Mara and to My Jewish Learning for having me once again, and for really the opportunity and the privilege to spend Friday morning with you, study the Parsha, and hopefully put ourselves a little bit in the Shabbat mood.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Moishe. And thank you all for learning with us today. We send a follow-up email every week, which includes our source sheets and a recording of the session. So if you want to revisit it or you missed something, you're going to be welcome to join or view the recording online. Also, we pose a question to you. What did you take from this session? We'd love to know. So feel free to email us back and let us know your thoughts on today's session. I, for one, enjoyed it. I hope you did as well. And echoing what Rabbi said, wishing you all a Shabbat Shalom. Bye-bye.
Thank you.